For cinematographers, right now we are spoiled for choice when it comes to incredible cameras that create incredible images. That doesn't mean there aren't some cameras that are better than others in a lot of different ways when you put together their entire feature set. So today we're gonna go through the C70. I'm gonna talk about a bunch of features that I think make this camera the best camera you can buy under $10,000. And there's one real big reason, which I will touch on at the end of this video, so stick around for that. Let's go through the Canon C70. If you're new here, my name is Curran Sheldon, and I'm an Oscar-nominated documentary filmmaker and ASC award-winning cinematographer. And the Canon C70 was actually the camera I used on the ASC award-winning film King Cole. So if the entire American Society of Cinematographers thinks the image holds up, then surely I do too. So the C70 was really Canon's first small cinema camera offering. They had the C100 and C200 before it, which were a little smaller than their big brothers, the C300 and C500, and way smaller than the giant C700. But the C70 was really Canon's attempt to make a large mirrorless body style cinema camera. Very compact, pretty darn light, but still full of incredible features. In a lot of ways, it was their answer to a lot of people who are using hybrid cameras for video. You could still have all the cinema features you wanted, but in a body that was just slightly larger than a big DSLR or mirrorless camera. It was also the first Canon camera to use the RF lens, which they announced with the R5 back in 2018. So while the C70 was definitely a standalone mini cinema camera, it was also the perfect B cam for the bigger brother C300 Mark III. They shared the same sensor and a lot of the same features. And so if you wanted to have a smaller, lighter, gimbal-friendly B cam to something larger like the C300, then the C70 was the perfect choice. But this camera is an A cam through and through. And I think it was underappreciated and underrated for a long time for one specific reason. 2020 was around the time that everyone was obsessed with full frame and large format sensors, and the C70 came out with a Super 35 sensor, or a crop sensor. The FX3, FX6, FX9, even Canon's own C500 Mark II, everyone was obsessed with large format cinematography, and therefore I think this camera was overlooked because of its Super 35 sensor, which is ridiculous because it has a ton of incredible points that we're gonna go through right now. Now, one way to get around the Super 35 field of view is to use a speed booster, which Canon sold with the Canon C70. And this allowed you to use your EF lenses, which a lot of people still had back in 2020 because the RF lens mount was very new. And then you could speed boost those lenses and still get that full frame field of view and add an extra stop of light to get that extra fast aperture, which gives you an equivalent similar depth of field to a full frame sensor. And that's the main reason people want to use full frame cameras, is to get that shallow depth of field and that larger field of view. And so the speed booster allowed you to get around both of those issues. Now, in direct comparison to the FX3, the C70 has a lot more going for it in terms of a cinema body. First and foremost is it can take a few different size batteries. So you could use a large battery like this one from Swit or Canon's own BPA60, or a smaller battery to keep it more compact like the BPA30. With these bigger batteries, it will last probably 6 or 7 hours. And that means you only need one, maybe two of these on a daily shoot, and this thing can run all day. Another big one compared to the FX3 is this thing has 10 stops of internal ND, and those NDs are fast. Just by cycling through the different ND strengths, you can really change your exposure and get the exact exposure you want, whether you're shooting at f1.4 or f4 or anything in between. One more note about the NDs, and I think a lot of people love the Sony FX6 variable NDs, but for me it has two big issues in comparison with the C70s. The first is it's just not strong enough. I find myself going to 10 stops quite a bit on the C70 when I'm outside on a bright day. If you want to shoot at f1.4, f2, or even f2.8 on some zoom lenses, then 7 stops on the variable ND of the FX6 is just not enough. I also do quite a bit of work on water or outside, and you're not able to use a circular polarizer when using the FX6 variable ND because of the way the ND functions. One thing that people really disliked about the FX6 was the fact that it didn't have any audio inputs on the body. The only way that you could get 2 XLRs and a 3.5mm jack is by putting on the top handle. With the C70, that's no problem. You have 2 mini XLRs and a 3.5mm jack, which means that you can have 4 channels of audio right here on the body itself. And that's a pretty incredible feature for a camera this small. So that's the incredible hardware inside the C70. 10 stops of ND, great battery life, and incredible audio features. But it's the internals that make the C70 really shine. Probably the coolest feature in the C70 since launch is that via firmware, Canon introduced internal compressed RAW inside the C70, which means you can get 12-bit 4K RAW with a full sensor width up to 60 frames per second. That's something that the FX6 or FX3 can't do. While I will admit that Sony probably has the better autofocus compared to the C70, the C70 has some incredible autofocus functions that really make it a very useful feature. The main one being face only autofocus, which means that if you have face detect on and the autofocus is trying to find my eye or my face, if I go out of frame, then that means the camera won't do anything. It's only going to use the autofocus feature if there is a face detectable on screen, which is great for things like this when I'm doing a talking head video, or even if you're on a gimbal and just filming someone walking towards you. So that feature alone makes the autofocus really, really useful. One other incredible feature is the fact that the C70 has a timecode port right here. So you're able to use this with external audio or with multicam situations, and you can always sync all your C70s, either C300s, your Aries, whatever you're using that has a timecode port, you could sync. Going back to the body, the camera also has a ton of programmable buttons. You got 2 up front, a bunch on the side, some on top, some in the back, and so you can program this camera to pretty much however you want it to work in your workflow. So all those features are really useful and make the Canon C70 just a really incredible cinema camera for a lot of situations. But the main reason the Canon C70, in my opinion, is the best camera you can buy now under $3,000 on a lot of used markets is because of the most important thing that a camera can give you, and that's the image. I have been testing out a lot of cinema cameras, a lot of the new mirrorless cameras, and every time I come back to the C70, I am blown away by how incredible the image is. And the main reason it's so good is because Canon has put a DGO Super 35 sensor within the C70, the exact same one they had in the C300 Mark III. When it first came out, a lot of people were just like, oh, it's not full frame, and like FX6 is full frame, and it's about the same price, and FX3 is cheaper, and it's full frame. But in my opinion, the DGO sensor within this C70 is way more important than having full frame, because the image that comes out of this camera is bar none the finest image you can get under $15,000. DGO stands for dual gain output, which is different than dual native ISO. So dual native ISO is where the camera performs at those native ISOs the best that it can perform. So it can be 800 ISO and 5000 ISO. But what dual gain output is doing is that within the camera itself, for every frame, it's actually reading 2 gain signals, one for the highlights and one from the shadows. And what that gives you is a really incredible dynamic range. And I can tell you that I used a C70 as a B cam to an Alexa Mini on a feature dock last year, about to come out early next year, 2026, check it out. And this camera held up beautifully. Side by side, the images were almost indistinguishable. For a camera this size, at this price point, to compete with the best cameras ever made is a pretty incredible feat. Along with that DGO sensor and incredible dynamic range, the C70 also has incredible colors. Even for Canon, who is known to have great skin tones and great colors, the C70 is by far their best, in my opinion. And when compared to the FX6 and the FX3, which I always find the image to be pretty thin and the colors to be just a little off, the C70 looks continually cinematic and beautiful. So the most important thing for me is the image, and this camera has that, no problem. Best image, in my opinion. But there are some cons. The first is there's no SDI port, which in professional workflows is a bit of a bummer, but they rectified that on the C80 and added an SDI port up here. So hopefully if there is a C70 Mark II, they'll add an SDI port as well. The second is I don't love the fact that the screen's on the back. I prefer to put cameras into my body like this and have the screen out front a little bit, and so this makes it a little bit awkward. But the screen is bright. I've used it without a monitor many times and have always hit focus, so you can definitely pull focus off this thing. You just have to figure out a system to get another point of contact out in front of you. And probably the most glaring issue for Canon specifically is they don't really have any Super 35 or APS-C lenses for the RF mount that is worthy of such an incredible camera. All of their APS-C lenses generally go with their cheaper mirrorless bodies and are often variable aperture zooms. Luckily, Sigma is here to step in. Now, this new 17-40 f1.8 is the perfect pair for the C70. So you have an incredibly professional lens. You can get that shallow depth of field that full frame gives you on an f2.8 zoom, but in a much smaller and lighter package, and still get the incredible image of the C70, which is the whole point in the first place. If you want to have the image that comes out of this camera, you're gonna have to use it and not anything else. I think the moral of the story is not always get caught up in specs, to get caught up in the fact that something can shoot at 12,800 ISO. You know how many times I've gone above 3,200 ISO on this camera in 5 years? Zero times. I've never shot above 3200 ISO, and at 3200 ISO, this camera looks great. I just make sure I always have f1.8 or f1.4 lenses on me in case I get into serious low light situations. Also, you know how many times that an audience member has come up to me after a screening of King Cole and said, man, that was a great looking film, but would have been better if it was in full frame? Also zero. 0 times. Nobody ever says that. The audience doesn't care if you shoot in Super 35, Micro Four Thirds, or full frame. What the audience cares about is how the film makes them feel, how the images change their perception of what they are watching. And for that, the C70 allows you to get beautiful cinematic images no matter the scenario and no matter the subject matter. And that's why I continually reach for this camera, because it allows me to get images that I'm proud of, that look beautiful on the big screen, and trust me, I've watched a lot of them on the big screen with this camera, and that's why I reach for this camera any chance I can get. So the C70 is 5 years old now, so I'm incredibly excited to see what Canon can do with all this DGO technology, but either make it full frame or put it in a smaller body, put it in a different type of body, and see what they can do with that incredible technology. So what about you? Have you used the Canon C70, or is there any piece of gear that you use that you think is very overlooked and underappreciated? Let me know in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next video.